Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to have a think about how to use Neapolitan chords. So first of all, let's just be sure about what a Neapolitan chord is. It's one of these chromatic chords that we sometimes use to add colour and something maybe slightly less expected. So we've got what we call our diatonic chords. So if we're in the key of C major, here's the scale of C. And the diatonic chords are the chords that sit comfortably in that key. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Where we're just building triads on each degree of the scale by using a root, a third, and a fifth, and obeying the key signature for the key. So when we have a chromatic chord, that's a chord that adds a bit of colour, often by using accidentals that are foreign to the key, yet the chord still has a function within the key. So the Neapolitan chord is based on chord 2. So if I'm in the key of C major, chord 2 is D, F, A, and all I need to do is to lower the root and the fifth by a semitone or a half step. So I get D flat, F, A flat. So I take chord 2 and I lower the bottom note and the top note by a semitone or a half step. Or you can think of it another way, which is to build a major triad on the flattened second. So if we're in C major, the flattened second is D flat, build a major triad, D flat, F, A flat. Either way, you get the same chord, and it's the Neapolitan chord. The Neapolitan chord is normally used in first inversion. So normally we have F at the bottom with the A flat and the D flat coming above the bottom. You don't have to do that, but often that's the way in which it gets presented. So now a lot of people have been in touch to say, well, I kind of know what a Neapolitan chord is, but actually how do I use it? And that's a very fair question. So first of all, let's just talk about resolutions, because a Neapolitan chord is often known as one of those predominant chords. So in other words, you can have a Neapolitan chord and you can follow it with chord 5. So I'm in C major, I found my chord 2, I've got my Neapolitan organised, D flat, F, A flat. I've now put that in first inversion, so I've got F in the bass, and I can go from there to a chord 5, a dominant chord. So that's one way of resolving it, a little bit of a surprise before a dominant chord. The other most common way of using it is to do the same thing, but to have a chord 1 in second inversion before you go on to that dominant chord, that chord 5. So I use a Neapolitan, then I use a chord 1 in second inversion, and then I move on to my chord 5. Now, in a way, that's a slightly smoother progression, and you can probably hear that. So if I go straight from the Neapolitan to chord 5, sounds all right. If I use 1C first, it's slightly smoother. So those are your possible resolutions, the chords that follow the Neapolitan. But we also need to think about what we call the approach chord. So what's the chord that we could use before we sound the Neapolitan? And what I've done here is just to present the various options that you might like to go for. And we'll talk about these in a bit more detail. Now, there are different ways in which you can lay out the chords, different embellishments you could add to it, all sorts of things you could do. So this isn't the last word on it. This is just to say something about, well, which are the best approach chords, and then you can work out which ones you prefer, how you want to lay out the chord, how much you want it to be plain or to decorate it within essential notes. That's all fine. So that's the kind of background to what we're doing here. But one thing I would say to you is that when you deal with a Neapolitan chord, and particularly when you resolve it, it's very easy to end up with consecutives. So you have to be very careful to check when you're leaving a Neapolitan chord onto the chord of resolution, have I got consecutive fifths somewhere or consecutive octaves? It's very easy to do. It's also very easy to end up with double major thirds. So in the Neapolitan chord in the key of C, well, F is the major third of that triad. So sometimes it's quite difficult to avoid doubling the major third, which is something we're often advised to do. However, in the case of Neapolitan chords, you will quite often end up doubling the major third. You don't have to, but you quite likely will do in certain instances, particularly when you're trying to avoid this consecutive problem in relation to the following chord. And that's not considered a serious offence in the case of a Neapolitan chord. Okay, now let's have a look at our first example, because I'm now going through the diatonic chords, which are perhaps the most common approach chord. So in the first example, you can see that I've got a chord 1 followed by the Neapolitan chord. So let's have a listen to that. Well, that seems to work all right, doesn't it? And in fact, it's quite smooth part movement, isn't it? You notice the top part just going up 1, the alto doing the same, the tenor doing the same. So you have that kind of straight triadic movement there with just a leap in the bass. So going from chord 1 to a Neapolitan is a pretty good thing to do, works quite nicely. In the second example, I've just shown you a variation of that, by this time using chord 1 in first inversion. And in some ways that's a more common use. And the reason for that is that you get that stepwise movement in the bass. Rather than having to leap a fourth in the bass, here we're just moving up a step from E to F. So some composers prefer to use the tonic chord in first inversion before they're using the Neapolitan chord, which of course is also usually used in first inversion. So you might think this is a slightly smoother progression. It's a moot point. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. But I think you can hear that's just a slightly smoother progression. Not a big deal, but one to think about. Okay, let's look at example 3, and we can now see what we're doing here. And when I get to example 3, I'm also just beginning to include the possible resolution, but this time using as resolution chords, chord 1 in second inversion followed by chord 5. So here I've got chord 2, and I'm using chord 2 in first inversion. Now, why am I doing that? Well, you could use it in root position, but if I had a D in the bass there instead of an F, I would be following a D natural in the bass with a D flat in the soprano, which gives me false relations, all right? So if I've got one note in one part, and then in a different part, in a different octave, I've got the same note with a different accidental following it, that's called false relations, and it just sort of jars a little bit on the ear, doesn't it? So if I had this chord 2, but I put it in root position, it would sound like this, and then you just get that kind of slightly tweak on the ear with the D natural, D flat, giving you false relations. How do you fix that? Well, you put chord 2 in first inversion, and then you don't have that false relations issue. Of course, if you do that, well, really you've got to use this double major third, because then you could say, well, why have I got two Fs here? That's a double, sorry, but this is a double minor third, sorry, because it's chord 2, so that's not a problem, is it? So I can use the two Fs here because we can double a minor third. Great. Okay, so moving on from that then, if I put 2 in first inversion and then I use the Neapolitan straight after, that's quite a smooth progression. You see, I can use these common notes in the tenor and the bass, and these parts are both just moving a semitone. So that's quite a nice progression, isn't it? And then here's how they resolve by using 1 in second inversion to 5 in root position. So you see, I've got 2B, Neapolitan, and then 1C, or 1 in second inversion, followed by chord 5. And that's quite smooth all round. All the part writing is nice and smooth. Look at that soprano part, coming down a semitone, coming down another semitone, coming down another semitone. Look at the alto part, coming down a semitone, coming down another semitone. Tenor part repeats a note, comes down a semitone, comes down a tone. Bass part repeats a note, comes up a tone. So it's kind of really smooth progression there. And in many ways, because the Neapolitan is a modification of chord 2, then an ordinary diatonic 2 is a good approach chord for it. Okay, now I haven't suggested using chord 3 as an approach. Generally speaking, chord 3 is not such a good approach. If I use chord 3 and then I go Neapolitan, sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? I mean, partly this interval at the top, well, you could rearrange the chord differently and do that, but it still sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? So generally speaking, chord 3 is not a great approach to a Neapolitan. So if you've got other options, go for them. Okay, well, in example 4, we're looking at using chord 4 as an approach. So here's your chord 4 in root position, followed by the Neapolitan. Here's the Neapolitan, followed by 1 in second inversion, followed by 5 again. So let's hear what that sounds like. Well, that's quite a strong progression as well, isn't it? Because the thing is that chord 4 has got notes in common with chord 2, and even with the Neapolitan, you've got that F in common, because in chord 4, we've got F at the bottom, but F is the middle of your Neapolitan. So having common notes is a very good way of kind of smoothing the progression. And I'm trying to make the most of those common notes, as you can see here, by having two Fs in the lower two parts between the 4 and the Neapolitan. So here's the 4, followed by the Neapolitan. Okay, well, there you've got a double major third in the Neapolitan, haven't you, with the two Fs. But as I say, it's not considered such a great offence in relation to a Neapolitan chord. And the fact that it gives you those two common notes from 4 before it makes for something that strengthens the part writing. And again, you can see, okay, we've fallen a third at the beginning in the soprano, then it's all stepwise movement. The alto is all going very smoothly there with, you know, down a semitone, down another semitone. The tenor repeating, then coming down by step, the bass repeating, going up by step. You know, you see that the part writing is quite smooth, but 4 works well onto a Neapolitan, mainly because of that common note F. Okay, example 5 is using chord 5 as our starting point. So the dominant chord is the most important chord after the tonic chord in a kind of diatonic chord hierarchy. So often works well, doesn't it? And what I've done this time is to just show a slight elaboration of things. So we've got chord 5 here. We're going on to the Neapolitan here, but you'll notice I've just done this little bit of melodic decoration at the top, you know, just to show that's something you can do. And you might be thinking, oh, I can't see anywhere to put any passing notes or auxiliary notes. But here, you could just hop from one harmony note to another. So in this example, I've just done a bit of decoration. Here it comes. It just makes it a slightly more triumphant Neapolitan. So you see how that one works. So there's just an example of how to embellish it. Now, it's slightly more awkward from 5 in a sense, but the main thing is if you're going to use it to try and protect your melodic line a bit. So with this G going to A flat, just a semitone and then falling a third and then going by step, actually the melodic line works quite well. In this case, the alto line works quite well. I mean, going from B to D flat may seem slightly strange, but that's because of the Neapolitan. But then coming back within it by step means that even though there's something slightly awkward about that interval, the stepwise movement that follows on sort of mitigates that a little bit. The tenor's got a slightly angular leap in this example. You can see I've gone D up to A flat. Now that might trouble some people because that's a tritone, not the best melodic move in the world. But then you have to consider, what are the alternatives? Well, if I'm going to use 5 at the beginning, surely some people will say, why didn't you use a G there? Because you could have gone G to A flat and back to G. That would have been great. The trouble with that, if I'd gone G here to A flat there, I would have had consecutive octaves with the soprano. This is what I mean. It's very easy to end up with consecutives when you're approaching and resolving Neapolitan chords, so you've got to be very careful. How do I avoid that? Well, the only thing I can do really is to use that D even though it's generated that tritone. It makes for a fuller chord 5. If I'd had G in the tenor, there would have been 3 Gs in that chord and no 5th, so it makes for a better, stronger chord 5, but the price I'm paying is to have that tritone in the tenor. However, if you have a tritone in the tenor, well, try to resolve by step within the leap, which is what we're doing here. And again, you hear that 1 in second inversion to 5. It's a smoother resolution, isn't it? Okay, and in the last example here, I'm using chord 6 as an approach chord. So how does that one work? Here's 6. Well, it works quite well, doesn't it? And you can see that going from 6, actually it's quite smooth. I have a semitone up there, the semitone down there, semitone up there, falling a third there, so that's quite smooth. Going on to the resolution, well, the soprano part's all moving nicely by step. The alto's got this little leap of a third, no big deal. The bass goes by step, that's good. Again, the tenor part, slightly awkward going from D flat to G. So this is another tritone. So you see quite often you end up dealing with these tritone situations. So in the previous example, going from 5, we had a tritone from the approach chord to the Neapolitan. And in the example 6, where we're using chord 6, we've now got this issue where we've got a tritone leaving the Neapolitan going on to the resolution. You know, you've got to kind of weigh these things up to make sure that you don't have consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves. And if you fix it by coming out of the Neapolitan to the resolution, that you then don't generate fifths and octaves from the approach chord. So it comes with a kind of musical health warning, if you like, that we have to be particularly careful with these consecutives. So I hope this video helps to explain how to use Neapolitan chords in major keys. What's a Neapolitan chord? It's the major chord on flat 2. How do we use it? Normally in first inversion. How do we resolve it? By going to 5 or by going 1 in second inversion, then to 5. How do we approach it? Well, we've considered approaching with 1, 1B, 2B, 4, 5, or 6. So have fun with your Neapolitan chords. Now, if you've found this video interesting and you want to go into more depth on this, you can find more about Neapolitan chords in our advanced theory course. at www.mmcourses.co.uk. You'll also find a very practical course on keyboard harmony that covers Neapolitan chords and the other chromatic chords, as well as how to do keyboard harmony with the diatonic chords. And there's lots of other stuff on the website that might be of interest to you in our courses section. You might also be interested in joining Maestros, so click on Maestros on the home page to find out all about that. Lots of perks come with being a Maestro member, including discounts on courses and the chance to meet like-minded musicians from across the world in our monthly live streams. Lots of exciting stuff, so you can read all about that on Maestros.